BYU, speaking of rides, are on their way to Orlando, Florida. Yes, they are going to be taking on the UCF Knights down there in Orlando, and looking forward to this. Should be a big opportunity for BYU on paper to go up and pick up their first Big 12 win ever. Now, that got a little more complicated Wednesday night when the UCF Knights upset then number 3, or I guess, yeah, be then number 3, Kansas, 65-61. A huge win for UCF. There's no if, and, or but about it. The Orlando Sentinel said it was the biggest win in UCF history, and for good reason, because when you do that on your home court, get your first ever Big 12 win, and beat one of the true blue bloods of the sport of college basketball, yeah, that's awesome stuff for UCF. I'm super jealous that UCF got a home game against Kansas this year. I would have loved for BYU to have had Kansas coming to the Marriott Center. Alas, BYU will make their lone trip, or the lone game against Kansas. They'll make the trip to Lawrence to play in Fog Allen Fieldhouse, which is in and of itself is a really cool thing. But still, to have UCF hosting Kansas, crazy game. But there are some concerning things for the BYU basketball program as they go into this game. None bigger, it feels like to me right now, is that the turnover woes. And remember, last year we talked all the time on this podcast. Those of you who are longtime listeners can remember the podcast last year in the basketball season, and just the lamenting of the fact that BYU was a turnover machine as a team. They were routinely 14, 15, 16, 17 turnovers a game, and it absolutely crippled their chances to win basketball games. Well, BYU have been doing a pretty good job during the non-conference slate this year of limiting those turnovers. I think it was Jay Drew wrote this for the Deseret News. He did point out that BYU had been averaging just about 10 turnovers, less than 10 turnovers a game in non-conference, but so 10.6 is currently for BYU, and that has moved up after the result of the last 2 games for BYU against Cincinnati, and particularly most recently against Baylor. BYU had 14 turnovers in that game against Baylor. 18 points came off of those, and that's a huge reason why they lost 81-72 to the Baylor Bears. BYU has to avoid turnover woes if they want to win games in the Big 12. The problem is Johnny Dawkins, the head coach for UCF, he's got a really, really high-intensity defensive style that UCF relies on. They forced, let's see, was it 18 turnovers? Yeah, 18 turnovers on Kansas in that 65-60 upset win Wednesday night. Well, you can guarantee BYU is going to come into UCF, and UCF's going to be thinking, okay, if we can turn over Kansas that much, we're going to get after BYU, and we're going to make their life miserable. BYU, this is of paramount importance for BYU to take care of the basketball. One other thing that Jay Drew pointed out, and I had not considered this, and I went back and checked it for myself. Did you guys know it's been 7 straight games stretching back to last season since BYU won a true road game? Yeah, it's been quite a long time for BYU since they have won on the road. This is not going to be an easy game, but the hope for BYU going into this UCF matchup is that the Knights have a little bit of that hangover effect. They've got that halcyon high of beating the number 3 team in the country, and they have that letdown that very routinely happens when you get a big win like that. The problem is UCF is forcing 16.7 turnovers on average per game with Johnny Dawkins' defense out there. This is a UCF team that is not necessarily the most gifted team offensively, and I'd actually say far from it. That's the biggest thing BYU's got to be understanding is that UCF wants to make games a rock fight. They want to turn you over. They want to get buckets in transition. They want to muck it up and make it tough for you to go out there and run your offense. And BYU has learned very early on, I think here in Big 12 play, that Cincinnati, Baylor, they all have that intention of forcing BYU to make mistakes and punishing them for those mistakes. It's going to be very, very imperative that BYU make sure that they cover for themselves. Jalen Sellers is the leading scorer for UCF on the season, averaging 17.8 points per game. Darius Johnson, his backcourt running mate, is averaging 14.1, and then Marcellus Avery is the only other player in double digits on average scoring-wise, 10.1 points per game, albeit doing it in just 22 minutes. That's pretty efficient on his end. As a team, UCF is shooting on the season a grand total of 43% from the field, 32.5% from 3. This is a team that if BYU takes care of the basketball, runs their sets, gets their ability to shoot the basketball back on track, which they actually had for stretches of that Baylor game, it could set up for BYU to go out there and get their first Big 12 win. But that turnover issue that has reared its ugly head for BYU basketball is going to be a massive, massive concern until Mark Pope's squad proves that they can take care of the basketball. There's a big point being made, and a lot of people have mentioned it on social media. We talked about it a little bit, I think, in our postcast after the Baylor game, the podcast we did right after that, is that Dallin Hall is really the only true point guard on BYU's roster. Now, there was obviously, during the offseason, they thought Quez Glover was going to be that guy. He ultimately decides to leave BYU, ends up transferring to Kansas State, and crazily enough, he hasn't even played basketball for Kansas State, and he very well may not play this entire season for the Wildcats due to multiple injuries. But that being what it is, BYU doesn't have a true backup point guard to handle the ball when Dallin Hall is off the court. And there have been a lot of people out there that have got concerns that Dallin Hall is shooting BYU out of basketball games. Mark Pope acknowledged that he's in a bit of a slump right now during his media availability on Wednesday. And I think Dallin Hall would tell you that, yes, he is in a shooting slump. But Mark Pope said this, shoot or shoot. And the biggest thing for me with Dallin Hall is he takes 2, maybe 3 shots a game that are like, why are you doing that? Why are you pulling from there? There's a 40-footer against Cincinnati that just, you're like, what are you doing there? Are you just hoisting up a prayer and hope it's going to knock it down? The shot selection, the decision making for Dallin Hall can be questionable at times with his shots that he takes on the court. I'm not going to question, though, that his ability to distribute the basketball, he's averaging better than 2 assists to every turnover. So he's doing his job as the point guard or handling the ball most for BYU. The biggest question is, who else can take that burden off of him? Well, there was some thought that might be Dawson Baker, but as Mark Pope pointed out, the decision is coming down the pipe, and I'll tell you right now that Dawson Baker, in my mind, is not going to play another game of basketball this season for BYU. He's had a surgery on that foot, has not responded to treatment, and the recovery window it just has not worked. So he's going to have to go undergo the knife once again to hopefully fix the foot issue that has been really hampering him. And that takes a guy off of the court that BYU may have turned to as that backup number 1 to be that point guard to handle things with the second team. Does that mean that it opens an opportunity for a guy, let's say, like a Jaxson Robinson? We saw Jaxson take a little bit more of point guard duties against Baylor. That may give him an opportunity to find better looks for himself, but he's also a guy that usually plays better off the ball. So you got to find an option for BYU to be able to facilitate your offense. Dallin Hall obviously is going to do his part. I can assure you of that. The problem is, who else can step up and be that playmaker? Can it be a Spencer Johnson? Could it be Ali Khalifa ends up playing point forward for BYU in many respects? You're going to have to adjust it, and BYU needs to understand that against UCF, take care of the basketball. I believe if BYU has under 10 turnovers in this game, they'll run away with a victory over UCF. Number 2, find good shots. I thought BYU's shot selection against Cincinnati was awful, and it improved markedly going into that Baylor game. Continue to do what you did against Baylor, running the sets and opening up the offense and making that extra pass to an open teammate. When BYU shares the basketball, that's when they've been at their absolute best this year. So I'd like to see BYU's assist to turnover ratio in this game be very skewed towards assists vastly outweighing their turnovers. I think it'd go a long way to helping BYU get their first ever Big 12 win. And then the third thing for me in terms of like a key to this game for BYU is just go out there and play loose. It feels like BYU can get a little tight. They got tight in that final 10 minutes against Cincinnati when the officiating got questionable against Baylor, which Mark Pope, he's the water bottle that exploded would indicate that he was not happy with the officiating. But you got to go and just play loose, play basketball, and understand why you're playing this game. It's easy to get uptight, and it's easy to be like, okay, we got to grind through this. I want to see BYU relax a little bit out there. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because you're supposed to be locked in, you're supposed to be doing your thing, but there is a level to where if you're so laser focused and so locked in, that actually comes to your detriment as a basketball team. So I'm looking forward to this game. It's a 2:00 tip here on the Wasatch Front, 2:00 Mountain Time, 4:00 Eastern. So it's a mid-afternoon tip. We'll do a postcast edition after it goes final with some thoughts. And I would sincerely hope we're celebrating BYU's first ever Big 12 win. It would be a big deal, I think, for BYU to get off the schneid and get that victory over the Knights, and we'll see what happens. We'll talk about that, like I said, on a postcast edition tomorrow on the podcast.